The air buzzed with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses, a kind of sound that only fills rooms lined with wealth. Oscar leaned back, his fingers swirling the champagne in his glass, his gaze drifting lazily across the crowd gathered at Freddie's mansion. Everywhere, the elite of Leos showed off their designer outfits and flawless smiles, mingling like they were on a stage, each move deliberate, rehearsed. Oscar took it all in, hardly noticing the glances thrown his way. He was the picture of success, a tall, striking man, nearing his 40s, and one of the wealthiest CEOs in the country. Real estate, oil, and a life filled with everything money could buy. But tonight, that all felt hollow, like a theater set where he played his part with a mask on. Underneath, there was a restlessness that none of this could soothe. Oscar, Freddie's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Freddie, with his mischievous grin and eyes that always seemed to hold a secret, leaned in, chuckling. "You're too quiet tonight, my friend. Too serious." Oscar gave a half-smile. "Just taking it all in. It's the same, you know? The same faces, same conversations." Freddie laughed, his shoulders shaking. "And yet you look bored to death. What's wrong? No one here catching your eye tonight?" Oscar let his gaze roam over the women in the room, each one flawlessly dressed, polished, laughing a bit too loudly at jokes that fell flat. "They're here for the money, Freddie, not for me." He sighed, the weight of his own words hanging heavy in the air. Freddie laughed, a bit too loudly, his amusement bubbling up. "Always so cynical, Oscar. What, you think you're some sort of gift to the ladies, huh? Always talking like you could have anyone." Oscar shook his head, his expression unreadable. "It's not about being a ladies' man, Freddie. It's just reality. Success attracts people who want things. Things I can give, but that's it." Freddie's eyes gleamed, a spark of excitement lighting up his face. "Well, since you're so sure of yourself, how about a little challenge?" Oscar raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A challenge? Go on." Freddie leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You say you can get any woman to fall for you. All right, then. I bet you can't marry a woman completely different from the type you always go for." Oscar's expression turned curious. "Different how?" Freddie's grin grew wider, a hint of mischief in it. "Someone who doesn't fit the mold. She's not slim, not dressed in designer labels, and she's not floating around high society. I actually saw someone the other day. She works at a cafe nearby. She's bigger than most, let's say. Not someone you'd usually notice." Oscar let out a low chuckle, the absurdity of the idea catching him off guard. "So what? You're challenging me to marry an overweight woman?" Freddie nodded, his grin never faltering. "Exactly. But here's the catch. Not just marry her. Keep her as your wife, genuinely, for 5 months. If you can, I'll give you that contract you've been after. You know the one." A flicker of interest crossed Oscar's face. This contract was worth millions, one he'd been after for months. But this was more than a bet for money. It was a matter of pride now. Freddie's smugness was tempting, and Oscar never shied away from a challenge. "All right." Oscar's voice was firm, resolved. "You've got yourself a deal. But remember, Freddie, you'll regret underestimating me." Freddie extended his hand, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the bet. "Good luck, my friend. You're going to need it." Oscar grasped his hand, sealing the deal. The sun blazed in the sky the next morning as Oscar navigated his car through the crowded streets, a stark contrast to the sleek, quiet neighborhoods he was used to. Here, people moved with purpose. Vendors shouted over each other, offering fruits, vegetables, and colorful fabrics, while the spicy scent of street food floated in the air. Oscar felt like a fish out of water, but he was here with a purpose. Freddie's words echoed in his mind, mentioning a woman, overweight and working at a cafe. A few conversations with the locals led him to the place. Sarah's Cafe Delight. Oscar parked, gazing at the small, unassuming cafe with its wooden exterior and handwritten sign. It had a charm to it, but it was far from the refined places he typically dined. He hesitated at the door, feeling a strange nervousness he wasn't accustomed to. This wasn't just about winning a bet. It was about stepping into a place that felt like a different world. After a moment, he drew a breath, opened the door, and was greeted by the aroma of freshly baked bread and the rich scent of coffee. Inside, the cafe was warm and welcoming, with shelves lined with homemade jams and pastries. Behind the counter, a woman was kneading dough, her hands moving with a practiced ease. She was fuller-figured, her apron fitting snugly around her frame, and her thick black hair was pulled into a simple bun. Her face, round and kind, had a warmth to it, though a hint of weariness lingered around her eyes. This was Sarah. She looked up, her hands pausing as she took in the sight of a man in an expensive suit standing in her cafe. There was a flicker of surprise, but she quickly wiped her hands on her apron and offered a polite smile. "Good morning. Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice calm and welcoming. Oscar responded with a smooth smile, one he knew often worked wonders. He felt the weight of Freddie's bet on his shoulders but pushed it aside. "Good morning. I'm Oscar. I was just passing by and couldn't ignore the wonderful smells coming from your cafe." Sarah blinked, clearly caught off guard by his presence and compliment. "Thank you. So, what can I get you?" Oscar hadn't actually planned what he'd say beyond entering. He hadn't come to buy anything. He was here to win her over. "Actually," he began, trying to sound casual though there was a slight hitch in his voice, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight." For a moment, silence hung between them. Sarah's eyes narrowed a bit, and she crossed her arms, her stance steady and grounded. "Dinner? With you?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes held a cautious curiosity. Oscar maintained his confident look, despite feeling a tinge of unease under her gaze. "Yes, I'd love to get to know you better." Sarah's face didn't soften. If anything, her expression turned skeptical, and she studied him for a long moment. "You don't seem like the kind of man who'd come all the way here just to ask me out. Why are you really here?" Oscar froze, caught off guard by her bluntness. He had expected a bit of flattery, maybe surprise, or even interest. But Sarah seemed different. She was watching him carefully, almost as if she could see through his act. She wasn't like the women he usually charmed with a few well-placed words. She was sharp, and beneath her gentle exterior, there was a strength that he found refreshing. Unnerved, yes, but also refreshing. For the first time in a long time, Oscar didn't have a rehearsed answer. Oscar offered a gentle smile, deciding honesty might be his best approach. "I saw your cafe and was curious," he admitted, almost laughing at himself for the awkwardness of his words. "Honestly, this isn't where I'd usually be, but," he hesitated, then continued, "something about you caught my attention." She softened slightly, though a trace of weariness remained in her expression. She seemed used to dealing with strangers with questionable motives. "I'm here until 7, she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. He nodded, feeling a rush of relief that she hadn't dismissed him entirely. 7 o'clock, exactly then. As he left the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual encounter. The initial excitement of winning a bet was overshadowed by something deeper. This woman, Sarah, was different. She didn't fall for his usual charm, and he found himself wanting to try harder, to show her a side of himself he rarely revealed. That evening, Oscar was there at exactly 7. Sarah stepped out, wearing a simple dress that flowed around her. She looked nothing like the glamorous women he usually dated. Still, there was something captivating about her, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, her hair cascading softly, framing her face in loose curls. As they drove through the city, a comfortable silence settled between them, though he sensed her discomfort. Once they arrived at the upscale restaurant, Oscar noticed her gaze dart around, taking in the elegant surroundings, her shoulders tensing slightly. The glimmering crystal glasses and pristine white tablecloths stood in stark contrast to the warmth of her little cafe. She hesitated as they sat down, her fingers tracing the edge of the menu as if it were foreign territory. "This place is different," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't really go to places like this." He offered a reassuring smile, hoping to ease her nerves. "You don't need to worry. Tonight's on me." Sarah returned a tentative smile, but her gaze didn't lighten. "It's not that, really. It's just, this isn't my world. I prefer things simpler, less flashy." As the evening went on, Sarah's initial tension faded, replaced by an openness Oscar hadn't expected. She talked about her cafe, how she'd built it from scratch, pouring her heart into it after her mother passed away. Her voice grew vibrant with passion as she described the hard work she'd invested, the long hours, the sacrifices. It was clear how much it meant to her, how every cup of coffee was brewed with a piece of her own story. Oscar found himself captivated, more than he'd ever been by the glossy stories of his usual dates. "What you've done is incredible," he said sincerely. "Not many people could accomplish something like that." Her face softened, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Thank you. But most people don't see it that way. They look at me and make assumptions. I get judged before they even know what I'm about." Oscar felt a pang of regret, realizing he had been one of those people. He had come here on a whim, driven by a shallow bet. But hearing her, he could feel the weight of her experiences, her resilience. People can be blind sometimes. But what matters is that you know what you've achieved. The rest of the evening drifted by as if they were in a world of their own. Sarah had a witty sense of humor, and her laughter, soft and genuine, lingered long after they finished their meal. When he dropped her off that night, he stayed in his car for a moment, watching her walk to her door. For the first time, he wondered if this connection was worth risking his heart. Over the next few weeks, Oscar found himself returning to Sarah's cafe almost daily. He'd arrive with flowers, pastries, and small gifts that seemed trivial in his world but brought her a quiet joy. They would spend hours talking, sharing bits of themselves. She was cautious, her guard still present, but little by little, he felt her warming to him, trusting him. As they grew closer, Oscar started to value her world, the small joys, the hard-earned successes. It was a life far removed from his usual pursuits, but it felt more fulfilling, more real. Yet, a nagging thought haunted him. He knew he had to come clean about the bet, but fear kept him silent. What if she turned away? The thought of losing her felt like a wound he couldn't bear. Each day he delayed, torn between his growing love for her and the secret he carried. It was late evening, and the air was heavy as Oscar and Sarah strolled back from another day meeting suppliers. Sarah glanced at him, her voice breaking the silence. "Oscar," she began, hesitant, her gaze drifting away. "Why are you doing all this? Why me? You could have anyone." "I don't understand." Oscar looked down, his heart thudding in his chest. He hadn't expected her to ask, but he found himself searching for an answer, one that would make sense of everything he was feeling. "Honestly, I'm not even sure," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But with you, I feel like I can be myself. You don't care about the money or anything else. You just care." A faint smile touched Sarah's lips, though a shadow of uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "I've never had someone like you take an interest in me," she murmured, almost as if she didn't believe it. "It just feels too good to be true sometimes." Oscar's chest tightened with a pang of guilt. He should tell her the truth, but fear silenced him. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it firmly, his fingers curling around hers with a promise he hadn't yet spoken aloud. "It's real, Sarah," he whispered. "I swear it is." As time went on, the lines between what he'd started as a game and the reality of his feelings blurred until he was sure of one thing. He was in love with her. This wasn't about winning a bet anymore. Sarah had changed him, made him question everything he thought mattered. So one night, he took her to a quiet restaurant, somewhere simple where she'd feel at ease. After their meal, he dropped to one knee, pulling a small, simple diamond ring from his pocket. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Oscar, what are you doing?" Oscar smiled, feeling a rush of nerves. "Sarah, I know it's sudden, but I've never been more certain of anything. I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked from him to the ring and back again. I don't know what to say." "Are you sure, Oscar? Are you really sure?" He nodded, his voice quiet but sure. "More sure than anything." With a shaky hand, she reached out, taking the ring. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was a small, intimate ceremony, far from the grand event his friends might have expected. He wanted it that way, just close family and friends, people who mattered. As he watched Sarah walk down the aisle, her father at her side with tears glistening in his eyes, Oscar felt a deep sense of peace. This was where he was meant to be. But as the ceremony went on, Oscar couldn't shake the shadow that had followed him, the truth he'd never revealed. He had won her love, but he feared it was all built on a lie he hadn't yet faced. 2 months later, at a party with friends, the truth slipped out, as secrets often do. Freddie, intoxicated and careless, laughed as he raised a glass. You know, the only reason Oscar ended up with Sarah was because of a bet, right? It was just a game at first. I never thought he'd actually go through with it. Sarah froze on the other side of the room, the words slicing through the air. She slowly turned, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. Her voice trembled as she managed a whisper. "What did you just say?" Freddie's laughter faltered, and he looked at her, a slow realization dawning. "Sarah, I didn't mean." But the damage was done. Sarah fled the room, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking with each step. Oscar ran after her, desperate, but when he caught up, he saw her standing at their front door, a suitcase packed by her side. His heart dropped. "Sarah, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Let me explain." She shook her head, the hurt evident in her eyes. "Explain what, Oscar? That my entire marriage is a joke? That you only came to me because of some stupid bet?" "It started as a bet," he admitted, his voice choked. "But it's not that anymore. I swear I love you, Sarah. You've changed everything." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "How am I supposed to believe you now? You lied. Oscar. You lied about everything." With a final heart-wrenching look, Sarah left, leaving Oscar alone in the empty house, surrounded by the silence of his broken promises. In the days that followed, Oscar's world fell apart. He couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but Sarah, her laughter, her strength, the way she believed in him. The bet that had once seemed so trivial had become the costliest mistake of his life. He tried everything to win her back. Letters, flowers, messages, all were met with silence. Desperate, he went to her father's house, only to be met with cold anger. "You're not a man," her father spat, his face full of contempt. "You played with my daughter's heart. You'll never see her again." Weeks turned into months, and Oscar felt hollow. The contract, the success, all the things he had once valued meant nothing now. Sarah had been his world, and without her, he was left facing the emptiness of a life built on things that never really mattered. Oscar had tried everything to reach her, to explain, but each attempt seemed to make the distance grow. He looked exhausted as he stood outside her cafe one last time, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Simple, just like she'd always liked. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he hoped he could show her who he had become. When Sarah finally agreed to meet him, Oscar felt his heart twist with both hope and fear. The cafe was quiet as he entered, its familiar warmth shadowed now by the sorrow in her eyes. She stood behind the counter, looking weary and cautious. Her expression was guarded, the openness that once welcomed him replaced by something colder. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Oscar," she whispered, her voice steady yet fragile. "You broke my heart. I don't know how to trust you again." He knelt in front of her, the weight of everything he'd done pressing on him. His voice shook as he spoke. "Sarah, I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I love you. I never meant to feel this way, but you changed me. Please, just give me a chance." Sarah looked down, her face a mask of pain. "I don't know if I can." Oscar's heart sank, but he nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. But I'll wait. As long as it takes. I'll do whatever it takes." In the weeks that followed, Oscar returned to the cafe often, sometimes just to sit quietly with a coffee, leaving only after the day ended. He brought her flowers, not to woo her back, but to remind her he was there, waiting, proving to her each day that his words had been real. Gradually, she started to notice his gestures weren't about grand apologies or charm. They were quiet, steady, filled with sincerity she hadn't seen before. Months passed, and as the cold winter began to soften into spring, Sarah found herself glancing over to him more often, seeing not the man who had hurt her, but the man who was willing to change. She saw his humility, the genuine regret in his eyes each time he met her gaze. She knew the scars he'd left wouldn't simply vanish, but slowly, the warmth between them began to grow again. One quiet evening, As they sat alone in the cafe after closing, she looked over at him, her face calm, though her eyes still held the wisdom of the pain they'd been through. "Oscar," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I'm willing to give this one more chance, but you need to understand. Love isn't a game. If you ever hurt me again, there won't be a third chance." Oscar looked at her, relief and gratitude filling his eyes. "I promise, Sarah," he replied, his voice steady, "I'll never take you for granted again." In time, they renewed their vows, this time with a different kind of commitment. One built on honesty, vulnerability, and a love that had been tested and proven true. Oscar didn't just support her dreams. He shared them with her, standing by her side as they opened a beautiful new cafe together, blending her warmth and charm with his business expertise. At the grand opening, as customers filled the cozy space they had built together, Sarah stood beside him, a soft smile spreading across her face. She glanced up at him, her eyes shining with a mix of peace and wonder. "I never thought I'd be here," she said quietly, her voice filled with awe. Oscar smiled, squeezing her hand. "Neither did I, but I'm grateful every day." And for the first time, he understood that he'd gained something more valuable than any win or wager. He had earned her love, learned what it meant to cherish it, and in doing so, he'd become someone he never imagined he could be. They weren't perfect, but they were real. And together, that was more than enough. If this story resonated with you and you're looking for more uplifting and inspiring tales, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's explore stories that highlight the incredible strength of the human spirit and the blessings life brings. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm excited to share more stories with you in the next video. Remember, embrace the positivity around you and believe in the incredible beauty of life. Let's keep inspiring one another.